The boardroom fell silent as Victoria Sterling's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Loyalty isn't something you buy, Marcus. You purchase compliance. Her words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving, as 20 executives around the mahogany table shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Victoria sat perfectly still, her charcoal suit immaculate, her steel-gray eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator. The merger deal worth $8 billion was being negotiated in this private medical wing that resembled a luxury hotel more than a hospital, complete with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and the faint scent of jasmine barely masking the clinical smell of antiseptic. Behind a service door that blended seamlessly into the wood paneling, Thomas Weber pushed his cleaning cart with practiced silence. He moved like a ghost through the corridors, invisible to the power players who shaped fortunes with their signatures. His weathered hands gripped the mop handle as he listened to the escalating tension in the boardroom, recognizing the same electric charge that preceded a medical emergency. Thomas had learned to read the signs during his years working these halls, the subtle shifts in breathing, the microscopic tremors that betrayed fear beneath confident facades. 20 years ago, he had been Dr. Thomas Weber, a rising star in biochemistry, but life had stripped away his white coat and replaced it with cleaning supplies. Victoria rose from her chair to pour herself water from the crystal pitcher, her movements fluid and controlled. But Thomas noticed what others missed, the barely perceptible tremor in her left hand, the way she paused mid-reach as if fighting against an invisible force. Her fingers wrapped around the glass with deliberate care, betraying a weakness she couldn't afford to show. The water touched her lips for just a moment before the glass slipped from her grasp, shattering against the marble floor like her composure. Her body convulsed once, twice, then collapsed with the violence of a controlled demolition, her powerful frame crumpling as if all the steel had suddenly turned to sand. Chaos erupted in the boardroom as chairs scraped against marble and voices shouted over each other. "Call security," someone yelled. "Get the medical team." Another voice cut through the panic, demanding immediate action. But Thomas remained still, watching with the trained eye of someone who had seen death dance around hospital beds for decades. This wasn't a heart attack or a stroke. There was something deliberate about the way her nervous system had shut down, something that spoke of chemical interference rather than natural failure. He watched as the emergency team burst through the doors, wheeling Victoria away on a stretcher while her personal effects scattered across the floor. Among them, a small silver jar caught the light, its elegant surface reflecting the chaos around it like a mirror holding secrets. As the last of the medical team disappeared down the corridor, Thomas knelt to clean the shattered glass, his movements methodical and unhurried. But his eyes weren't on the crystal fragments. They were studying the silver jar that had rolled near his feet. The label read, "Alpine Essence Swiss Formula," in elegant script, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed the peculiar shimmer of the cream inside. His doctoral training in biochemistry had taught him to recognize danger in the most beautiful packages, and something about this expensive cosmetic triggered every alarm bell in his scientific mind. As he carefully placed the jar in his cart beneath a cleaning cloth, Thomas Weber realized that the most powerful woman in the building might be fighting for her life against an enemy that none of the doctors would think to look for. The medical wing transformed into a battlefield of controlled chaos as Victoria Sterling's unconscious form was rushed through corridors that had never witnessed such urgency. Thomas Weber continued his methodical cleaning, but his mind raced with possibilities that the attending physicians weren't considering. He had spent enough years in these halls to recognize the difference between natural medical emergencies and something far more sinister. The way Victoria's pupils had dilated just before the collapse, the specific pattern of muscle contractions, the slight discoloration around her fingernails that spoke of systemic toxicity. These weren't symptoms that appeared in medical textbooks under executive stress or cardiac episodes. As he moved through his cleaning routine, Thomas found himself gravitating toward the intensive care unit, where Victoria now lay surrounded by machines that beeped with increasing irregularity. Dr. Sarah Chun emerged from Victoria's room, her usually composed demeanor cracked with frustration and exhaustion. She paused at the nurse's station, reviewing charts with the kind of intensity that suggested nothing was making sense. Thomas had observed Dr. Chun for months during his night shifts. She was brilliant, thorough, and never missed a detail. But now she looked defeated, staring at test results that clearly weren't providing answers. "All cardiac markers are normal," she muttered to the attending nurse. "Neurological scans show no trauma, no evidence of stroke or aneurysm. Blood work is clean except for some minor liver enzyme elevation." Thomas slowed his mopping, positioning himself within earshot as Dr. Chun continued her verbal puzzle solving. It's like her nervous system just decided to shut down for no medical reason whatsoever. The silver jar from the boardroom sat on Thomas's cart, hidden beneath cleaning supplies, but weighing on his conscience like evidence of a crime yet to be proven. During his break, he retreated to the maintenance closet and carefully examined the cream under the harsh fluorescent light. The consistency was wrong. Too smooth, too lustrous, with an almost metallic sheen that didn't belong in any cosmetic product he'd ever encountered. His hands trembled slightly as he unscrewed the lid, memories of his graduate research flooding back. Years ago, he had studied heavy metal compounds and their effects on human physiology, research that had been cutting edge before his world collapsed and forced him into this invisible existence. The cream's subtle scent carried undertones that triggered recognition in his trained olfactory memory, something synthetic masked by expensive perfumes. Victoria's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the night as Thomas maintained his vigil from the shadows. Her breathing became more labored, her heart rate increasingly erratic, and most tellingly, her hair began to show signs of rapid thinning that couldn't be attributed to stress alone. Thomas watched through the observation window as Marcus Hoffman arrived with another silver jar, his expensive suit and practiced concern fooling everyone except the janitor who had learned to see through facades. Marcus moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being believed without question, his handsome features and commanding presence opening doors that money alone couldn't breach. He spoke in low, concerned tones with the medical staff, positioning himself as the devoted business partner worried sick about his colleague's mysterious illness. As dawn approached, Thomas made a decision that would either save Victoria Sterling's life or destroy what remained of his own. He carefully collected samples of the cream using makeshift laboratory equipment stolen from supply closets, cotton swabs, small vials, and basic chemical reagents that any hospital maintenance department would have access to. In the abandoned pathology lab that had been closed for renovations, Thomas Weber began to conduct the kind of analysis that had once been his life's work. The preliminary tests sent ice through his veins as familiar chemical reactions played out under improvised conditions. The cream contained traces of compounds that had no business being anywhere near human skin, compounds that would absorb slowly through dermal contact and wreak havoc on the nervous system. But proving it would require resources he didn't have and credibility he'd lost 20 years ago when grief had forced him to abandon his doctoral research and disappear into the invisible world of night shift maintenance work. The fluorescent lights in the abandoned pathology lab flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows across Thomas's makeshift laboratory as he worked through the early morning hours. His hands moved with the precision of muscle memory, 20 years of dormant expertise awakening as he conducted tests that would have been routine in his former life, but now felt like acts of rebellion. The cream sample reacted exactly as his worst fears had predicted, the silver compounds separating under heat, the telltale precipitation patterns forming when exposed to reagents he'd improvised from cleaning supplies and medical waste. Each positive result sent another chill down his spine, confirming what he'd suspected but hoped he was wrong about. Victoria Sterling wasn't suffering from a mysterious illness. She was being systematically poisoned by someone with access to sophisticated chemistry and unlimited patience. The morning shift change brought new energy to the medical wing, but Thomas noticed the subtle signs of defeat creeping into the staff's demeanor. Victoria's condition had stabilized but not improved, leaving her in a twilight state that baffled every specialist who examined her. Dr. Chin looked particularly haggard as she reviewed the latest test results with a team of consulting physicians who had been called in from prestigious medical centers. Their hushed conversations revealed the depth of their confusion. All standard toxicology panels had come back negative. Brain scans showed no abnormalities, and her vital signs fluctuated in patterns that defied medical explanation. Thomas listened from his position cleaning nearby windows, understanding that their failure to find answers wasn't incompetence, but rather a limitation of looking for conventional threats when facing an unconventional weapon. Marcus Hoffman's arrival at precisely 10 o'clock confirmed Thomas's suspicions about the calculated nature of this attack. The man moved through the hospital corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged, carrying himself like a concerned partner while his eyes betrayed a cold calculation that made Thomas's skin crawl. Marcus spent exactly 15 minutes in Victoria's room, speaking in low, soothing tones about business continuity and recovery timelines, all while applying a fresh layer of the cream to her hands and arms. The nursing staff accepted his explanation that it was a special moisturizer Victoria preferred, imported from Switzerland and essential for her comfort during recovery. Thomas watched from the hallway as Marcus performed this ritual of care that was actually a ritual of murder, his movements practiced and precise as if he'd done this many times before. The breakthrough came when Thomas discovered Victoria's personal effects in the storage room, where they'd been placed after her collapse. Among her belongings was a small leather journal, and thumbing through its pages revealed entries that painted a picture of gradually declining health over the past month. Victoria had documented strange symptoms, episodes of confusion, unexplained fatigue, moments where her hands trembled uncontrollably during important meetings. Most significantly, she noted her growing dependence on the cream Marcus had recommended, writing that it was the only thing that seemed to calm her nerves during stressful periods. Thomas realized he was looking at the victim's unwitting documentation of her own poisoning, a slow and methodical campaign that had been building toward this moment when she would be too incapacitated to prevent the merger that would make Marcus incredibly wealthy. As afternoon gave way to evening, Thomas made copies of everything: the journal entries, his test results, photographs of the cream samples, and detailed notes about Marcus's visits and their correlation with Victoria's symptom spikes. He understood that his word alone would never be enough to convince anyone, especially given his status as a night shift janitor with a mysterious past. But he also knew that if he remained silent, Victoria Sterling would die within days, and Marcus Hoffman would walk away with $8 billion and a perfect murder. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, and Thomas realized he would need to find someone in the medical establishment willing to listen to an impossible story told by an invisible man. As he prepared for the most important conversation of his life, Thomas Weber felt the weight of his abandoned career pressing down on him, demanding that he remember who he used to be before grief and circumstance had forced him into the shadows. The confrontation Thomas had been dreading finally arrived when Dr. Chun discovered him in the pathology lab at 3 a.m, surrounded by his improvised testing equipment and evidence folders. Her initial shock at finding the night janitor conducting unauthorized chemical analysis quickly transformed into something more complex as she examined his meticulously documented findings. Thomas watched her face change as she processed the implications of what he'd discovered. The correlation charts showing Victoria's symptom spikes coinciding with Marcus's visits, the photographic evidence of the cream's abnormal composition, and most damning of all, the positive results for heavy metal compounds that had no business being in any cosmetic product. Dr. Chen's scientific training warred with her institutional loyalty as she realized that accepting Thomas's evidence would mean acknowledging that her entire medical team had missed an attempted murder happening under their noses. The revelation of Thomas's true identity came slowly, extracted piece by piece as Dr. Chen pressed him for explanations about his expertise and methodology. 20 years of buried credentials emerged like artifacts from an archaeological dig. His doctoral research in biochemical toxicology, his published papers on heavy metal poisoning, the promising academic career that had ended abruptly when his wife's death from cancer had left him emotionally and financially devastated. Dr. Chen listened with growing amazement as Thomas described his fall from the ivory tower of academia to the invisible world of night shift maintenance, a journey that had taught him to observe human nature from angles that no medical school could provide. His unique position as both a trained scientist and an overlooked employee had given him insights that the hospital's prestigious medical staff, for all their expertise, simply couldn't access. Victoria's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse, just as Thomas and Dr. Chun were reviewing the evidence. her monitors suddenly erupting in alarms that brought the entire night staff running. Thomas watched through the observation window as medical personnel fought to stabilize her failing nervous system, their efforts hampered by their ignorance of the true cause of her deterioration. Marcus Hoffman appeared within minutes, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, his concerned facade perfectly calibrated to deflect suspicion while he positioned himself to make critical decisions about Victoria's care. The speed of his arrival and his immediate assumption of authority over her medical decisions confirmed Thomas's worst fears. This wasn't just attempted murder, but a carefully orchestrated plan to ensure Victoria died at precisely the right moment to maximize Marcus's financial gain. The ethical dilemma facing Dr. Chen crystallized as she realized that conventional medical protocols wouldn't save Victoria's life, while Thomas's unauthorized intervention might be her only hope. Standing in the hallway outside Victoria's room, Dr. Chun made the career-defining decision to trust the janitor's analysis over her colleague's expertise, quietly authorizing treatments for heavy metal poisoning while keeping the true nature of Victoria's condition hidden from Marcus and the hospital administration. Thomas provided her with detailed protocols for chelation therapy, drawing on research he'd conducted decades earlier but never imagined he'd need to apply in such desperate circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on him that his greatest professional triumph was happening while he wore a janitor's uniform and worked in shadows, saving a life that the entire medical establishment had written off as mysteriously unsalvageable. As dawn approached, and the chelation therapy began to show its first tentative signs of success, Thomas realized that Marcus would soon discover that his perfect crime was unraveling. The businessman's carefully constructed timeline depended on Victoria remaining incapacitated long enough for the merger to proceed without her interference, but her unexpected recovery would expose his entire scheme. Thomas understood that they were entering the most dangerous phase of this deadly game, where a desperate man with billions at stake would be willing to take increasingly desperate measures to silence the only people who knew the truth. Standing in the maintenance closet that had become his secret laboratory, Thomas Weber prepared for a confrontation that would either vindicate 20 years of invisible service or destroy the fragile new life he'd built in the shadows of medicine. The hospital's executive boardroom had never hosted a meeting quite like this one, where a night shift janitor sat across from the chief of staff, the head of toxicology, and 3 board members, presenting evidence that one of their most prominent patients was the victim of an elaborate murder plot. Thomas Weber's hands remained steady as he laid out his documentation, each piece of evidence carefully arranged to tell the story of Victoria Sterling's systematic poisoning. The room's atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the medical professionals examined his chemical analysis, cross-referenced his timeline with Victoria's medical records, and struggled to reconcile the impossible reality that their janitor possessed expertise that surpassed their own consulting specialists. Dr. Chun served as Thomas's advocate, her reputation lending credibility to his findings while she explained how the chelation therapy had already begun to reverse Victoria's mysterious symptoms. Marcus Hoffman's reaction to being summoned for questioning revealed the calculating mind behind his charming facade, his initial confidence gradually cracking as Thomas presented evidence that exposed 20 years of careful planning. The businessman had built his scheme on the assumption that no one would look beyond conventional medical explanations, never imagining that a former biochemist working in maintenance would recognize the signature of his exotic poison. Thomas watched Marcus's performance with the analytical eye of someone who had learned to read people from the shadows, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed panic beneath practiced composure. When confronted with the cream samples and their chemical analysis, Marcus's legal training kicked in as he demanded to know who had authorized testing of his personal property, but his outrage couldn't mask the fear in his eyes as he realized his perfect crime was unraveling. The confrontation escalated when security footage revealed Marcus's pattern of visits, each one precisely timed to coincide with Victoria's application of the poison cream, and telephone records showed his communications with a Swiss chemical company that specialized in cosmetic formulations with unusual properties. Thomas felt a grim satisfaction as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place for the hospital board, their horror growing as they understood how close they had come to losing a patient to a murder that would have been recorded as death by natural causes. Marcus made one final desperate attempt to discredit Thomas by attacking his credentials and questioning why a man with a doctorate in biochemistry was working as a janitor. But Dr. Chin's defense highlighted how his unique position had given him insights that traditional medical hierarchy had missed. Victoria Sterling's recovery accelerated once the source of her poisoning was eliminated and proper treatment began, her strength returning with each passing hour as the heavy metals were flushed from her system. Thomas maintained his vigil from the hallway, watching through the observation window as consciousness gradually returned to the woman he had saved through careful observation and scientific deduction. When Victoria's eyes finally opened and focused on her surroundings, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with recognition or reward and everything to do with the fundamental human obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Her first words were a whispered question about what had happened to her, and Dr. Chin's gentle explanation revealed the truth about Marcus's betrayal and Thomas's intervention. The arrest of Marcus Hoffman sent shockwaves through the business community as federal investigators uncovered a conspiracy that stretched back years, involving forged documents, offshore accounts, and at least 2 other suspicious deaths that would now be reopened as potential homicides. Thomas provided detailed testimony about his findings, his analysis serving as the foundation for charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and financial fraud that would ensure Marcus spent the rest of his life in prison. Standing in the courthouse hallway after his testimony, Thomas realized that his 20-year exile from the scientific community was finally over, not because he had reclaimed his former status, but because he had proven that knowledge and conscience mattered more than titles or recognition. The invisible man who had cleaned floors while observing human nature had emerged from the shadows to deliver justice, and in doing so, had rediscovered the scientist he had never truly stopped being. The hospital's grand atrium buzzed with unprecedented energy as reporters, medical professionals, and curious onlookers gathered for what the media had dubbed the most extraordinary case of medical detective work in recent history. Thomas Weber stood at the edge of the crowd, still wearing his maintenance uniform but no longer invisible, watching as Victoria Sterling prepared to address the assembled crowd from a podium that had been hastily arranged near the memorial fountain. Her recovery had been nothing short of miraculous once the chelation therapy had eliminated the heavy metals from her system, but the psychological impact of discovering that her trusted business partner had been slowly murdering her for months was still evident in the careful way she moved and the steel that had returned to her voice. Thomas felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease as he observed the spectacle, knowing that this moment would forever change how he was perceived, but uncertain whether he was prepared for the attention that was about to descend upon him. Victoria's speech began with a detailed account of her poisoning, her voice growing stronger as she described the gradual onset of symptoms that had been dismissed by medical professionals as stress-related until Thomas's intervention revealed the sinister truth behind her illness. She spoke with the precision of a woman accustomed to commanding boardrooms, but there was invulnerability in her words as she acknowledged how close she had come to death and how the medical establishment's blind spots had nearly cost her everything. When she called Thomas forward to join her at the podium, the crowd's murmur of surprise rippled through the atrium as the unassuming janitor walked slowly toward the front, his weathered hands clasped behind his back and his eyes focused on Victoria rather than the cameras that tracked his movement. The juxtaposition was striking, the impeccably dressed billionaire businesswoman standing beside the man in work clothes who had saved her life through observation and scientific deduction. Thomas's reluctant acceptance of the spotlight came with a revelation that stunned even Victoria, as he quietly announced his decision to return to active scientific research under the auspices of a new toxicology institute that Victoria had agreed to fund in recognition of his life-saving intervention. The crowd listened in rapt attention as he described his plans to establish a laboratory dedicated to identifying unconventional poisons and training medical professionals to recognize the signs of exotic toxicity that traditional protocols might miss. His voice carried the authority of someone who had walked through the valley of professional death and emerged with hard-won wisdom about the intersection of science and human nature. The announcement that Dr. Thomas Weber would be leading this revolutionary approach to forensic medicine sent shockwaves through the medical community, many of whom were only now learning that the janitor they had overlooked possessed credentials that rivaled their own. The most dramatic moment came when federal agents escorted Marcus Hoffman through the hospital lobby in handcuffs. His expensive suit wrinkled, and his confident demeanor completely shattered as he faced the cameras that had once captured his success. Thomas watched without satisfaction as his former tormentor was led away, understanding that true justice lay not in revenge, but in the prevention of future crimes through better scientific vigilance. Victoria stepped closer to Thomas as Marcus disappeared into the waiting federal vehicle, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of gratitude that spoke louder than any public acknowledgement. The crowd began to disperse, but Thomas remained standing beside Victoria, both of them understanding that their unlikely partnership had forged something more significant than a single case of successful crime detection. They had created a new model for how overlooked expertise could challenge institutional blindness. 6 months later, Thomas stood in his new laboratory wearing a pristine white coat embroidered with his name and credentials, training a diverse group of medical professionals, forensic investigators, and even maintenance workers in the art of recognizing what others might miss. The walls were lined with case studies of successful interventions, including several instances where his former colleagues from the cleaning staff had identified suspicious patterns that led to breakthrough discoveries. Victoria visited regularly, not as a patron checking on her investment, but as a collaborator who had learned to see the world through the eyes of someone who had been invisible for too long. Their friendship had grown from the shared trauma of near-death and betrayal into something deeper, a mutual respect between two people who understood that expertise could emerge from the most unexpected places and that sometimes the most important discoveries were made by those who society had trained itself not to see. As Thomas looked out the laboratory window at the hospital where he had once pushed a mop through corridors of indifference, he reflected on the strange journey that had led him from the depths of professional exile to a position where his insights could save lives and prevent crimes that conventional medicine would never detect.